This week, I asked myself a question. What does peace look like? And I wondered if we would recognize it if we saw it. From the inception of time, mankind has been pursuing and working towards peace. Leaders throughout history and from every corner of the world have pursued peace. Wars have been waged and fought in the name of peace. Policies, plans, procedures, and rules have been made globally in the name of peace. Summits are held annually where leaders from the most powerful nations around the world gather and form alliances, all in the name to preserve peace at all costs. That's a symbol for the United Nations, by the way. And even with all of that, I wonder if we have really ever seen peace. And if we zoom in a little bit, beyond this global idea, you and I pursue peace in our own lives, don't we? We spend kind of the early formative years of our lives searching for our purpose, or our calling, if you want to use Christian terms. We want to make a mark on this world. We want to leave it a better place. We want to do something with our lives and with who we are. We want to work towards that. And when we find that calling, when we find our voice, when we find what we're made for, it is a beautiful thing. And part of that brings peace into our lives because we feel like we actually have a purpose and we're not just running on a treadmill. We surround ourselves with other people. We engage in relationships and we form communities, all so we can have a safe place. A place where we can share ideas with other people, a place where we can grow and explore and find our gifts, a place where we don't have to pretend to be anywhere else. That brings us peace when we find a community where we actually belong. And if we don't have either one of those, sometimes we pursue peace no matter how temporary it is, right? If I can't have this longing fulfillment in my life, then I'm going to get any amount of peace no matter how short-lived it is in my life. So we take what we can, right? We go on vacation to escape just so we can have a moment of peace. We have a few drinks just to relax and unwind because we just want to have that one night where the worries fade away a little bit and the voices aren't as loud. We say yes to all the delicious treats that we normally would not say yes to. Why? Because we just want that little moment of peace. We indulge sometimes just so we can have that moment or that feeling that things are okay, even if it is just for a little while. Now, I realize that for some, peace looks like the absence of war, or peace looks like a strong economy, or peace looks like the subjugation of enemies. For others, peace looks like the absence of loneliness, or an abundance of resources, or a form of personal fulfillment. But I wonder what peace really looks like. Throughout Scripture, peace has taken on many forms. It's looked differently. In the story of Noah, peace looked like what? Peace looked like a dove and an olive branch. That everything that they have experienced, now they had this symbol of peace and this symbol that everything was going to be okay. During the raising of Moses, during the Exodus, peace took on the form of a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke. It was what protected them. It was what let them know that they were going in the right way. It was what let them know that God is with them. It let them know that their journey had a beginning and an end and a purpose. And those two things brought them peace. In different eras and in different forms, it took the shape of judges that were supposed to rule with justice and speak for God in different lands. And then it moved on to kings with Saul and David, and eventually it ended up in prophets. All of these people were supposed to be markers of peace. But inevitably, they all somehow fall short. In the midst of all of these stories, there's one picture that is constant throughout the story of Scripture. And that's the image of a shepherd. Throughout the story of what will become the nation of Israel is the shepherd. He is the shepherd and Israel are the sheep. This is why we have the beautiful words from David, right, in Psalm 23 that most of us have heard in many different ways in many different moments. This is why David writes so beautifully and so eloquently that the Lord is my shepherd. I shall never be wanting. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters, and he restores my soul. He guides me and leads me in paths of righteousness. I don't have to fear, because his rod and his staff, the tools that he uses as a shepherd, they actually bring me comfort. And he prepares a table for me, even in the midst of my enemies. And this is something that pursues me all of my life. And I began to think that maybe this is what peace really looks like. Maybe peace isn't necessarily the absence of conflict. Maybe peace isn't found in the strength of the economy or the abundance of resources. Maybe peace isn't found in whoever is the leader or king or whoever has the loudest voice in the world as a prophet. Maybe peace can come to us from a shepherd. After all, that's what David was, right? David was a shepherd. Moses spent time in the desert shepherding flocks. See, I believe that this beautiful picture of a shepherd is kind of the peace that God really wants to provide for us, and the type of peace that he wanted for his people. It wasn't peace through power. It wasn't peace that everything was okay. It wasn't even peace through the abundance of resources. It was a peace that only God could provide. And before those beautiful words that Lynn read in Ezekiel chapter 34, we see this very angry God who's speaking through the prophet Ezekiel. And do you know why he's angry? Because the people that he has appointed as shepherds of his flock to oversee, to guide, to nourish, to lead his nation are not doing their job. Here's what he says. He gets to a place that Ezekiel say there's going to be a moment and there's going to be a time. When, these printed on cardstock this morning, which is beautiful. Okay, I like it. But it does this. It doesn't lay flat. So if you see me messing with it, that's why. Okay, so I use my Bible to try to get it to stay there. Okay. And after this, after God kind of sees that his people aren't being nourished and they aren't being led, after he sees the absence of peace where he desires it to be, he says that I myself am going to become your shepherd. And by the way, I think that's what God wanted all along. It was the people who said, no, we need a king. We don't really want you. We want something like everybody else has because this is what peace looks like. It looks like power. It looks good. It looks taller than everybody else. This is what we want, and we're going to follow that. And God said, okay, I'm going to let you have what you want. But now he says, I'm going to be your shepherd. I'm going to be the one who leads you and nourishes you. Because the people that were supposed to do it, these things that are in place in your lives are not bringing you peace. Here's what he says about the other shepherds. He says, woe to you shepherds in Ezekiel chapter 34, who only took care of yourselves. You ate curds and clothed yourselves, but you did not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak. You have not healed the sick or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You ruled them harshly and bitterly, and they became scattered and food for wild animals. My sheep were scattered, and no one looked for them. This is the situation that God saw his people. He saw them scattered. He saw that they were injured and they have wounds and nobody was taking care of them. He saw that they were in danger of becoming lost and nobody was looking for them. He saw that nobody was actually caring about them. They were caring about themselves first. And he says, this is not the way it's supposed to be. Because I want something different for my people. I don't want them to be hungry. I don't want them to be ravaged by the world that is outside the safety that I designed for them. I don't want them to be injured and say, I have to fix this myself. I want something different. So in response, God says those beautiful words in Ezekiel 34 where he says, there's going to be a time when I'm going to bring you back. And I'm going to look after them. I'm going to look after my sheep. I'm going to rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I'm going to bring them back from the nations, and I'm going to gather them from the countries. I'm going to bring them into their own land. We'll pasture them on the mountains. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lay down, declares the sovereign Lord. I'm going to search for the lost, and I'm going to bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. I will shepherd my flock with justice. God's going to do something. He sees his people in a state where he says, this is not supposed to be. So he says, I am going to become your shepherd. And you know what? Maybe that's what peace looks like. Because in John 10, we hear the words of Jesus proclaiming to everyone around him that he himself is our good shepherd. Now, as I look at John chapter 10, I think there are three things that remind me of the peace that God brings. You see, the first thing that I think John reveals to us in John chapter 10 is that we can find peace in God through the path that he has designed for us. If you want to turn to John 10. beginning in verse 7. And what verse 7 reveals is that we can find peace through the path that God has designed for us. The reality is that there are a lot of competing voices in your life right now. There are voices that are telling you what you should do, what you should look like, who you should be. There are voices and pictures all over your social media that lead you unintentionally into a place of comparison. That all of a sudden you are judging your gifts, what you do, and what you have to somebody else. And in the midst of that, I think we often search for a path. We often want to know which way to go. Am I heading in the right direction? What am I supposed to be doing? Who am I really? What purpose do I have in this world? And in the midst of that, we hear this voice saying, I am the good shepherd. And in the midst of all these competing voices, here's what it says. Beginning in verse 3. It says, the watchman opens the gate for him, meaning the shepherd. And the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes on ahead of him, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. How beautiful it is that the picture of a shepherd is to say, in the midst of the hundreds of sheep that may be in his flock, he knows every single one of them by name. And not only that, that he has spent time with them, that they know his voice. There's a story that I heard, and I think it's true, that there's watering holes in the desert. And these shepherds lead their flocks of sheep to these places where they can get nourishment, right? So at one time, you could have thousands and thousands and thousands of sheep in one place. Many different shepherds. Now, there's no gates. There's no numbering system. There's no like, hey, take a number, or hey, it's Tim's turn and Janice, you're next. It looks like chaos. But somebody who spent time in this environment says, you know what one of the strangest and most beautiful and awkward things I've ever seen in my life? That when a shepherd sees that all of his sheep have gotten the water and nourishment that they need, in the midst of the thousands of other sheep, he says something or whistles, and guess what happens? All of his sheep leave and they follow him. The rest of the sheep stay there. He was saying this over coffee, and he was just recounting this amazing, beautiful, craziest thing that I've ever seen, because he's like, how is this going to happen? This isn't organized. Okay, he's a type A personality. Everything has to be organized. And here's what I believe. In the midst of all of these competing voices, we have this loving God who pursues us. This God says, no, I know you. I know who you are. I know who I designed you to be. I know all these other voices are competing for your attention and telling you to go all of these different ways. But I'm inviting you to follow me. And we know his voice. This beautiful picture of peace that says, God knows me. And he calls me. And he invites me. For me, that is one of the most beautiful pictures of peace that I can understand. In the midst of all of these other voices inviting me into different directions, I have a God who invites me to follow him. In addition to this path that God invites us on of peace, I think one of the things I was struck by this week is the power that God has. It goes without question that the world often uses power to pursue peace, right? Look at some of the most developed countries in the world and look at the thing that is the highest on their budget. You're going to find that the military is one of the highest things on their budget. Why? Because there's this idea that I'm going to use power to preserve and provide peace. It's been like that since the inception of the world, and communities have gathered. People were judged how powerful they were by the size of their army, right? But here's what God says. God says, the Good Shepherd says something a little bit different. He uses his power in a different way. In verse 11, here's what he said. He says, I am the Good Shepherd, and the Good Shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. The wolf attacks and the flock scatters. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for his sheep. I am the Good Shepherd. A little bit later on, he says that this is actually the exercising of his power and his authority. So essentially, we have a shepherd that says, I'm going to use my power and my authority to lay down my life for you. In a world that says, I'm going to exert my power over you, we have a good shepherd that says, I'm going to use my power to give you life rather than to take it away. And I think how beautiful that is, and we hear the words in Philippians saying that Christ literally emptied himself, this word of kenosis, on the cross so that you and I can experience life. And what he says a little bit earlier is life to the fullest. We serve an amazingly mighty and powerful God who is willing to give up his own life so that you and I can experience the life that we were always designed and God desires us to have. So not only does he lead us to the right places, not only does he know us and know our names, but he has this power to actually bring us the life that we have always wanted, to remove the obstacles of sin and death and fear and doubt, these things that were never supposed to be a part of us. God removes those by his power. And the third thing that I see that brings us peace is simply presence. You know, our world is more connected than ever. Some of you have done more Zoom and online things in the past 2 years than you've done in an entire lifetime. And you're okay if that stops. I'm just going to be real honest with you. I don't like Zoom meetings. Never did like them, but I've had my fair share of them. But in the world that is becoming more connected than ever, we are simultaneously seeing a world that feels more isolated than ever. In some of the surveys that were done locally in different school districts, what we are seeing is that our youth are experiencing high rates of depression, loneliness, and anxiety. Their friends are literally buttons away, 2 button pushes, and you can connect with somebody, but yet they feel so isolated. And it's not just children, it's also adults. This is something we are experiencing culturally as a phenomenon. And in the midst of that, in the midst of this world in my phone where I have over 300 contacts and I can press 2 buttons and I can FaceTime with half of you here, There are still moments and times where we feel completely alone. And in the midst of that, I hear this idea that God is present with us. Here's what he says in John 10:14. He says, I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep. And my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for my sheep. Never underestimate the power of being known. Never underestimate the power of having a place or a person or a community where you don't have to pretend to be somebody else. Never underestimate the power of being known, that you don't even have to use words and somebody can know exactly what you're going through and they're not going to try to fix it. They are simply just present with you. Everybody desires this place or this person or this moment where we don't have to pretend, where we don't have to have it all together, where we don't have to have the answers, where we don't have to be what other people think that we need to be. And we hear Jesus saying here that I know my sheep. In the Western world, we think of knowledge as purely intellectual. Something that I can read, something I can get tested on, something I pass or I fail. It's all cognitive. But this is a different type of knowing. This portrays this idea that somebody has experienced life with you. And it's not that they know your name and your address, and it's not the $2 report you can print off online of everybody's life records. It's the person who knows you. The person who says, I understand. I know your scars. And that's okay. I know what you're struggling with. And you don't have to pretend to be somebody else when you're with me. See, that's powerful. And I think when I put all three of these things together, when I have a voice saying, John, come on. No, don't pay attention to those other voices. They don't really know you. And in the end, they're looking out for themselves. Come this way. It's okay, because remember what we said in Isaiah, that the mountains that are too big, I'm going to take care of those. The valleys that are too low, I'm going to raise those up. The path that's all over the place, I'm going to fix that. The rocky obstacles in your way, Isaiah 40 says there's going to be a guy coming that's going to tell you about a person who's going to clear all those for you. 2 weeks ago, we saw, it's the upper right candle for those of you who are wondering, we heard that this change is possible because it wasn't just an empty promise. We read and we hear about John the Baptist coming onto the scene and telling people to say, this is becoming a reality. Hope has been paired with resources, and now it's becoming a reality. And we saw that this person that brings all this into the world changes the world. It's a light that can't be overcome with darkness, and that brings us joy. And when I put together hope and change and joy, and I see a good shepherd who says, this is the path, follow me, and I have the power and the authority to clear your path and make your path straight. You're still going to have to do the work. You're still going to have to walk, but this is who I am, and I know you. That's what I think peace looks like. This invitation to follow the voice of a powerful God who knows us and wants to lead us into the paths and the places and to become the people that he has always designed and desired us to be. This is what we wait and hope for during the Advent season. This is where on this side of history we celebrate and meditate and focus on what we have. So I have some questions for you. Where, what, or who is your source of peace? And just like every other week, Advent isn't only a time to focus on Christ, it's a time for us to focus and to begin to honestly ask ourselves the questions. Where have I placed my hope? What am I hoping changes the world? Where is my source of joy? And today we're asking you the question, where, who, or what is your source of peace? Have you placed your source of peace or your hope that peace will come in some form of power? Have you placed it in a person? Is there a certain place that you have in your life where you say, I only find peace on this exotic island? So what is that for you? And what's the longevity of that? I think this is one of the reasons why in Ezekiel 34 we hear the words from Ezekiel that say, hey, listen, I gave you that olive branch and a dove to say, I'm never going to do this, and I hope the world doesn't go back to this chaotic place, but it did. And then he said, well, I'm going to give you these people, and they're going to kind of be judges. They're going to be my voice, and they are going to kind of organize and lead these communities to where I want them to be, and that's going to bring you peace. But in the end, we saw that pride and selfishness always led to the absence of peace, and they tried it through kings. And then finally he said, well, if you're not going to listen to me, maybe I can send some people that you will hear their voice, and it didn't matter. And all of those were temporary, and God says, I want to do something once and for all that does not have a time frame, that is eternal, that is going to be your source of peace. And it's not dependent on what's going on in the world. It's not dependent on what resources you have or don't have. It's dependent on my Son. And the government's going to rest on his shoulders. So what's your source of peace as you sit here today? And what's the longevity of it? And the second question is this. Where, what, or who have you placed your hope in? All of us long for peace and fulfillment. And to be honest, most of us spent years and countless resources in our life pursuing it. So where have you anchored your hope in terms of finding peace? Have you put it in a person? Have you put it in a possession? Have you put it in a relationship? Because one of the things that Advent does is not only something we can celebrate, it challenges us to realign ourselves with this beautiful Good Shepherd who says, I have the path, I have the power, and I am going to be present with you. And you know what? That's what I think peace looks like. Pray with me this morning. Heavenly Father, we are thankful that you sent your Son into this world. Father, as we are in the last week of Advent and as we approach the day which we celebrate your birth, Father, I pray that you would simply just be with every single one of us here. Be with us as we pursue peace. Help us, Father, to anchor our hope and our peace and our joy to you. And the fact that you came into this world so that we could become and the world could get back to the way you've designed it to be. Be with us, Father. Be with us today in this moment. Be with us as we move forward from this place. Be with us in our pursuit of peace. And may we be able to recognize peace as it comes from you. We ask this all in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.